Are you curious about Cuba's economic history? Cuba was once a prosperous country with a thriving sugar industry and a modern infrastructure. It had a higher GDP per capita, more doctors per capita than the UK, and a strong education system. But how did Cuba go from being rich to one of the poorest countries? In this video, we will explore Cuba's economic decline and how it struggled to survive despite having a healthy and educated workforce, natural resources, and tourism. We will delve into the reasons behind Cuba's economic collapse, including its dependence on sugar exports, U.S. interests, and the Soviet Union's involvement. Stay tuned to learn how Cuba's economy collapsed and what caused it to fall from grace. Upon his arrival in Cuba, Christopher Columbus was left in awe by its breathtaking beauty, a quality that proved to be a vital asset for the country's flourishing economy. Thanks to its sugar industry, Cuba reaped billions in the 1920s, with its pristine beaches and close proximity to the U.S. during the Prohibition era made it an irresistible destination for tourists. The grandiose hotels and modern infrastructure that sprouted up in Havana transformed the city into a luxurious paradise. By the late 1950s, Cuba boasted a high GDP per capita, a well-educated populace, and more doctors per capita than even the UK. Despite possessing a free market economy, an educated and healthy workforce, abundant natural resources, and a thriving tourism sector, Cuba has struggled economically for over 3 decades. In the 1990s, severe food shortages led to tens of thousands of Cubans going blind from malnutrition. The country's economy shrank by a third, leading to frequent power outages, high unemployment, and a loss of purchasing power, with many Cubans tragically losing their lives trying to flee by boat. Today, Cuba once again faces economic decline and food shortages. Its economic struggles date back to the early 20th century, following 400 years of Spanish rule and years of conflict before gaining independence. However, U.S. desire to control Cuba's lucrative sugar industry turned the country into a puppet state under corporate colonialism, protecting American businesses and promoting growth at the cost of Cuban sovereignty. After World War I, Europe's sugar beet fields were destroyed, destroying 20% of global sugar supply and changing Cuba's fate. After price controls were lifted, sugar prices skyrocketed, generating over $1 billion in 1919, more than the previous 14 years combined. Small-scale sugar farmers could buy expensive clothes and shop in Havana. As sugar prices rose, Cubans and Americans took out loans to increase production, thinking this was the new normal. By year's end, the bubble burst, leaving farmers in debt and 20 Cuban banks bankrupt. However, American banks survived and bought bankrupt sugar mills and more farmland to profit. Thus, Cubans owned only 20% of their sugar production, causing nationalist resentment towards the U.S. As the U.S. became the world's economic superpower and travel became popular, Cuban economy grew during the First World War. American tourists spent more on luxury hotels, casinos, and entertainment in Cuba. Despite economic growth, many independent sugar farmers struggled to make ends meet, and women turned to prostitution to feed their children. The Cuban government became corrupt and despotic, acting like a mob. Cuba's sugar and tourism-dependent economy suffered the most during the Great Depression. 6 years of Fulgencio Batista's violent military dictatorship had ended by 1958. Despite being the most literate nation in Latin America and adopting social and workplace freedoms early through educational campaigns, the economy had stagnated since the Great Depression and inequality was rising. Cubans wanted a government that protected their rights and freed them from corporate colonialism and military dictatorship. They did not initially seek a communist revolution. Cubans supported Fidel Castro's guerrilla warfare against the government after he arrived. Castro's coalition, which helped him win power, was mostly social democratic and anti-communist. The CIA's top Latin American expert believed Castro was an anti-communist fighter rather than a communist. After seizing power, Castro instituted important reforms, including agrarian reform. The Cuban government seized land above the threshold and turned it into state-run farms, putting U.S. investments under its control. The Soviet Union's 5-year agreement to buy 20% of Cuba's sugar and supply oil infuriated the U.S. Esso, Shell, and Texaco refused to process the oil at American-owned refineries on the island under pressure from Washington. Castro nationalized the refineries, prompting the U.S. to reduce the sugar quota, which had been the foundation of Cuba's economy for the 20th century. Castro seized all U.S.-owned assets on the island, ending diplomatic relations and prompting the Bay of Pigs invasion and numerous assassination attempts. John F. Kennedy's complete embargo on Cuban goods cut off trade with the West and forced Cuba to turn to the Soviet Union, hurting the Cuban economy. While Castro declared the Cuban Revolution socialist, the Soviet Union secretly deployed weapons of mass destruction in Cuba, causing the missile crisis. Following socialist policies, all private operations were nationalized. The state set prices for everything, demanded prices from farmers, and told industries what and how much to produce. Cuba's half-hearted central planning caused economic bottlenecks, unavailable inputs, neglected maintenance, and inefficient spending. Despite guaranteed employment, overemployment and sluggishness reduced productivity. Agriculture, the main profit maker, dropped 23% in 5 years. Due to Soviet loans and trade, Cuba's economy survived, but Castro's brutality and socialist policies failed. Despite other developing nations' exponential growth, Cuba's economy was smaller in 1971 than before the revolution. Cuba joined Comecon because its dependence on a single crop made it dependent on the Soviet Union. Cuba adopted a planned economy in 1972 with Soviet and Czech assistance to address the issue. This transition included replacing state loyalists with trained experts and reintroducing material incentives to boost productivity. Economic growth was also boosted by Soviet trade deals for oil, machinery, consumer goods, and sugar industry mechanization. Baby booms and female labor force participation increased the Cuban labor force. Cuba's communist golden age brought more opportunities and free, high-quality healthcare and education. By the 1980s, over-reliance on sugar exports, slumping global prices, and peaking industrial growth revealed systematic flaws. Cuba's economy was entirely dependent on sugar exports and Soviet subsidies, so its 1991 collapse was devastating. This slowed the economy, restricted speech, and threatened Castro's regime. Cuba's dependence on the USSR explains its economic crisis. In 1987, Cuba bought 70% of its trucks, 91% of its fertilizer, 70% of its iron, 94% of its grain, and 100% of its oil from the USSR. Sugar sales at higher than global prices dominated this trade. Cuba lost 35% of its economy and 80% of its international trade 4 years after the Soviet Union collapsed, causing food shortages. Despite avoiding famine, the average Cuban lost 20 pounds, and up to 40,000 went blind from nutritional deficiencies. Cities experienced frequent blackouts as industries were unable to produce anything without oil, and people bought food on the black market at exorbitant prices. Castro lamented that his regime was alone in a sea of capitalism. Castro had to adapt to a world without socialist trading partners to preserve his socialist regime. Cuba had a state-run centrally planned economy and a free market economy to fund it. Half of the state enterprises were closed to cut costs, leaving many unemployed. To compensate, a limited private sector allowed self-employment. State enterprises could use foreign currencies for profit-seeking. The dollarization of the economy, where the US dollar was legalized and often required for transactions, and the legalization and active encouragement of foreign investment, particularly in tourism, were the two biggest reforms. Havana's hotels, restaurants, and nightclubs expanded rapidly, generating nearly $2 billion annually. It worked but had strange side effects. Maids, hotel receptionists, taxi drivers, and restaurant workers earned more than doctors and teachers, who were still paid in pesos under the command economy. Dentists needed side jobs, and taxi drivers could only shop at dollar stores that never ran out of food. All Cubans became second-class citizens in their own country, enduring blackouts while peering into luxurious hotels with well-lit lobbies, struggling to find food while tourists ate at fancy restaurants, and waiting hours for delayed buses while restored 1950s taxis quickly ferried foreigners to the beach. Castro's reforms created a new class divide. Some industries grew, but the reforms that enabled this were discontinued and even reversed, reducing economic freedoms. Due to illness, Fidel Castro abdicated in 2006, and his brother Raul Castro was expected to bring about legitimate economic change in Cuba. After Trump's 2016 election, Cuba's economy deteriorated despite Obama's initial efforts to normalize relations with the US. Instead of reforming, the government fabricated economic data. Cuba exported many doctors and received Venezuelan oil subsidies. Raul Castro's 2013 reforms didn't change the economy, and future reforms won't either because those in power won't give up their power and privileges. Therefore, Cuba's economic future will likely be characterized by minor ad hoc reforms that do little to improve the economy, resulting in continued hardship for the Cuban people and limited opportunities for future generations, unless they leave the country. As we conclude this video, we can see that Cuba's economic journey has been one of the highs and the lows. From being a prosperous economic powerhouse to facing food shortages and economic decline, Cuba has seen it all. While some attribute Cuba's economic downfall to external factors such as the collapse of the Soviet Union and the US embargo, others point towards systematic flaws in Cuba's socialist policies and economic planning. Despite its challenges, Cuba's story is a lesson in resilience and perseverance. It serves as a reminder that economic success is not guaranteed, and that every country must continually adapt and innovate to survive in the global economy. Thank you for watching, and please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more informative content.